Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with F1 Kayak, and welcome to a new version of the second video in our series where I talk about the different kayaks that we build, their design features, and their performance characteristics. So today we're going to be talking about the LPB kayak, which is the longer of my two modern sea kayak designs. But before we get into that, I just want to let you know that we are only going to be talking about the design features in this video. So if you're interested in the construction details of the frame or the skin or the outfitting on any of my skin-on-frame kayaks, make sure that you check out the separate video titled Skin-on-Frame Details 1, Skin-on-Frame Details 2, and Skin-on-Frame Details 3, where we go into a huge amount of detail about all of that stuff. Also, I am super disappointed to tell you that I do not have any good rough water footage of this boat in this video because tragically my body does not work very well right now, which is incredibly annoying to me because this boat is excellent in rough water and I would much rather show you that than just tell you about it. So hopefully in the future I'll be able to add a separate video with more of that kind of paddling, but I did manage to get a bit of flat water footage. We shot some nice drone footage and we did some speed tests using the telemetrics on the GoPro that I think you're going to find interesting. So getting into this, the LPB stands for Long Pointy Boat, and this is a completely modern fitness-oriented sea kayak design built out of skin-on frame. The medium size is 16 foot 4 inches long and 22 inches wide, but only 21 inches wide at the front of the cockpit where you're taking your paddle stroke, and it weighs about 34 pounds. Now, keep in mind, those are just the dimensions of the medium size of this kayak, which is targeted at a 160 to 180 pound paddler. And just like all of my kayaks, the LPB comes in a variety of different sizes, so the dimensions and the weights are going to change a little bit just depending on the size of the boat. So I feel like the best way to understand what the LPB is and what it's good for is to start out by talking about my other modern sea kayak design, the F1. So the F1 is our flagship kayak design. It is also a modern sea kayak built out of skin-on frame, but it is 14 feet long and 23 inches wide in the medium size. But despite those dimensions, it's actually surprisingly fast. Now, additionally, the F1 is stable, it's comfortable, it is highly maneuverable, completely neutral in the wind, and it surfs better than almost any other sea kayak. The F1 is also the easiest of all of our kayaks to build, and the medium size weighs around 30 pounds. So for all those reasons, the F1 is generally my personal go-to boat, but just like any watercraft, there are always compromises. So the things that I don't like about the F1 is that even though it is highly efficient at normal cruising speeds, the paddling ergonomics aren't perfect and it sacrifices a little bit of speed towards the top end of the range. Basically, if the F1 was a car, you could think of it kind of like an SUV. Now, the LPB, on the other hand, has a similar cruising efficiency with a higher top speed, and it is designed from the ground up with paddling ergonomics in mind. It shares the same edge turn performance that the F1 has, and interestingly, the LPB actually has a little bit more primary stability despite the fact that it's narrower, although it does have less secondary stability than the F1. Now, just like the F1, the LPB is neutral in crosswinds, it doesn't weathercock, but the LPB isn't quite as good in extremely high winds because like all longer boats, it's more difficult to turn into the wind. Now, also, it's not quite as good of a surf boat if we're talking about ocean waves, although it's still probably as good or better than most other sea kayaks. Although, if we're talking about chasing wind waves in big chop, the LPB is actually really good at that. Now, for me personally, the things that I like the least about the LPB is that because it's a longer boat, it's harder to build, and it weighs about 4 pounds more than the F1. So, for example, the F1 built with red cedar usually clocks in around 31 pounds, depending on the size of the user, and the LPB is often closer to 35 pounds, and both those weights increase with the larger sizes. Now also, as someone who just generally likes short boats, I tend to be a little bit annoyed in tight spaces when I'm paddling this boat, also when I'm carrying the kayak and when I'm transporting it. Basically, if the LPB was a car, you could think of it more like a sports coupe. So that's a quick overview. Now, why don't we come in a little bit closer here? I'm gonna pull this model off the wall behind me, and we're gonna talk about the shaping of this boat and how that relates to different performance characteristics. So taking a look at this cute little half-scale model here, the first thing I want you to notice is that this kayak is almost all waterline. Basically, if I'm designing a sea kayak, I want every part of that kayak to be doing some sort of a job, and if it's not in the water, basically all it's doing is making your kayak longer and heavier and more prone to getting stuck sideways in sea caves. So even though this is only a 16-foot 4-inch kayak, it actually has a fairly long waterline for a mid-sized modern sea kayak. Now, coming around to the front of the kayak, notice the dramatically Swede form shape on this boat. Basically, we've got a long, thin knifing bow, we've got a paddler that is sitting significantly back from the center of the boat, and the widest point of the boat is actually back here, directly behind the paddler. And I designed this boat this way for a couple reasons. The first one is that this gives me a trim that will be neutral in a crosswind without having to add a skeg or a rudder, which just helps to keep the boat more simple. Also, by having the paddler's weight a little bit further back here, even though the boat is balanced so it sits level on the water, the boat can rise a little bit easier in the front, whether you're punching into chop or whether you're trying to punch out through the surf. And then simultaneously, when you're running downwave, the stern digs into the water, which helps it to surf a lot better. And then the last reason just has to do with hull efficiency. So I'm just going to turn this over for a second. So coming in a little bit closer, even though this is a hard chined kayak, if you just ignore the chines for a minute and look at the shaping of the underlying ribs, you're going to see that this is a very deep V section in the front that very slowly transitions into more of a rounded section that's still pretty round back here towards the front of the cockpit. And this gives us a couple of advantages. The first one is that introducing the volume of the kayak really slowly into the water like that when you're paddling forward tends to drive much less of a bow wave, and I feel like that's a sign that the kayak is a little bit more efficient. Also, this general shaping here kind of approximates more of a rounded shape as opposed to a boxy shape, which is going to have less wetted surface and therefore less drag. And then even back towards the back of the cockpit where this shape does start to flatten out a little bit more, I have a fairly flared hull section. So just for an example, if I take this piece of wood and I bridge from the gunnel over to the stringer, you can see that's quite a bit of flare right there. So that's also helping to approximate a little bit of a rounded shape to reduce wetted surface. And it also lets me have a kayak that has decent reserve buoyancy up by the gunnels, but is still sitting on a fairly narrow waterline. And then taking a look at this shape from the back of the boat, once again, you can see that flare angle towards the back of the cockpit. And then as far as how water is transitioning over this shape, once again, by slowly introducing the volume of the boat to the water, we're not driving a bigger bow wave, but we're also not prematurely activating any more turbulence than we have to, which gives a slight advantage for overall efficiency. But once you get towards the middle to the back of any sea kayak, that water is going to be tumbling down the sides in some pretty big vortexes, which is going to add a lot of drag, which means that I want to get rid of it as quickly as possible so I don't have any more drag than I need to. So for my own sea kayak designs, I try to make the sterns as blunt as possible while still having the water flow off of them cleanly. And this is a little bit tricky because if you get this wrong, basically you end up with big draggy vortexes back here, which makes the boat really, really slow. So for me, when I'm designing, it's just a process of trial and error, kind of inching up to that threshold and then backing off a little bit. And when I get this right, it gives me a hull shape that is nice and efficient, and then also has some really significant advantages for edge turning performance as well, for reasons that are a little bit more complicated than I want to get into right now. So turning this upright again, once again, you can see that really dramatically Swede form shape here with the widest point behind the cockpit right here, and then it just slowly tapers all the way to the bow of the boat. And another advantage to this type of hull geometry is that it places the area where you put your paddle in the water narrower than the widest point of the boat, which gives you an advantage for your stroke mechanics, especially if you like to paddle with an aggressive vertical stroke. Now, last thing I want to talk about before we move on is this really pronounced ridge right down the middle of the front deck. And the reason I set things up this way just has everything to do with practical considerations. From a framing point of view, this is the least amount of wood that I can put in the front deck, so that keeps things nice and light. And then from a cargo standpoint, the combination of this deck ridge and these curved deck beams gives me a really nice usable space up here that's easy to pack and unpack with camping gear. Also, this extra windage right here helps to keep the boat a little bit more neutral in a crosswind. And then finally, I do think a peaked deck tends to shed water a little bit better, although I don't think that effect is quite as pronounced as people like to think that it is. So if you don't have any specific need for the flat decked version of this kayak, I would just build the ridge deck version because it has so many more practical advantages. And if you want to learn about the advantages and disadvantages of the flat decked version, I would just go and watch the flat decked F1 video because everything that applies to that kayak also applies to the LPB as well. So coming back out to the actual kayak, I'm not going to talk too much about the deck rigging just because I have a completely separate video that goes into a lot more detail about all these options. Also, the deck rigging is going to change just depending on what you need for your personal boat. But just to give you an idea, on my kayak here, I have a pretty elaborate deck rigging setup because this kayak is rigged for our catamaran and sailing system. I also have an extra bungee ahead of the cockpit for anything that I need to tuck out of the way, but doesn't need to be held down securely. I've got perimeter lines all the way around, which is super important for rescues and safety. And then coming back to this deck line directly ahead of the cockpit, for this deck line and the grab loops at the ends, I always make these out of a heavy treated leather. And the reason I like leather for this is because it gives me a little bit of elasticity and a little bit of stickiness, while at the same time giving me the strength of rope, which means that I can tow or rescue or carry by any leather deck line on my boat. Now, the other nice thing about these leather deck lines is that if you pair them with a spare one-piece Greenland paddle, you can stick that underneath the loop at the bow here, and then you can slide it underneath this deck line back here by the cockpit. You can lock it down with this toggle, and now you have a spare paddle that you can grab in an instant if you end up upside down and you need to roll up, but it is also securely held on deck and it is not going to come off even if you end up getting thrashed in the surf, which is way different than what can happen if you have your paddle tucked underneath bungee cords. Now, coming on to the back deck, I've got this boat set up with catamaran loops instead of leather deck lines, which is something I'm doing on most of my own personal boats now, regardless of whether I'm going to catamaran, just because I like the functionality of these loops a little bit better for paddle floats, and also you can use them to improvise other types of temporary outriggers. Now, coming a little bit further back on the deck, I've got this ball mount for my action camera, and I've got a separate video here on the channel that shows you how to set this up. So if you're interested in self-filming from a sea kayak, this is super versatile. It gives a really nice perspective. And if you pair this with the telemetrics on a GoPro, it's also a really nice way to do speed checks as well. And then finally, at the very back of the boat, I've got this drain plug, which isn't super necessary, but it's also not that hard to install either. So I put this in my boat as well. Now, taking a look at the cockpit for a minute, this is just kind of my standard modern sea kayak cockpit arrangement. I've got this steam bent white oak keyhole shaped cockpit coaming. It's got a really deep lip on it, so it's going to be able to hold on to your spray skirt even if you're getting trashed in the surf. It's also compatible with a sea sock as well. I've got a back band that we have custom manufactured for us. And I have this set in here, so it's really supporting your sacrum a little bit more than your back, which actually is a lot more comfortable. And then I've got really minimal thigh braces right here. And the reason that I don't go bigger with my thigh braces is because as important as it is to be locked into your boat when you're rolling or doing control strokes, it's equally as important to be able to raise your knees up when you're paddling long distance so you can get a stretch and avoid fatigue. Because especially if you're paddling offshore and it's not possible to land, if you get uncomfortable in your kayak, that starts to become a big problem. Now, I'm not going to show you the foot braces or the seating arrangement in this boat because this kayak is about 3 years old now and I've upgraded some of these features. Basically, in our new kayaks, I'm giving you a choice between Select foot braces or Smart Track foot braces. And I've replaced the foam that we used to put underneath the ribs with a suspended seat option. And then just like always, we cap that off with a foam mat that goes in the entire seating area, which is nice and comfortable. It keeps you warm and it helps to keep grit out of the boat. Now, getting into how the LPB feels on the water, I've got to be honest here, for as much as I have talked smack about this and every other long sea kayak over the years, the reality is I actually really like paddling this boat. I mean, personally, I'm always going to be an F1 paddler just because it has a lot of practical advantages for the kind of paddling that I like to do. But if we're just talking about sitting in the cockpit and paddling, I think the LPB actually feels a little bit nicer because the entire boat was designed around the paddling experience ahead of every other design consideration. Now, as far as how fast it is, speed is always kind of a tricky subject for me because speed and efficiency are actually opposite design considerations. We've all heard that longer boats are faster, and while it is true that a longer waterline is going to allow you to achieve a higher top speed, it does that at the expense of a higher wetted surface area, which adds more drag, which makes the kayak less efficient and also makes it feel slow. So the art of designing a nimble sea kayak is really all about identifying the minimum top speed that your paddler can tolerate and then using that to set the waterline length so you can keep the drag as low as possible, which is what makes a sea kayak feel fast and playful. Now, another factor is the shape of the hull. Basically, the rounder that you make the bottom of a boat, the more water it's going to displace for the same amount of surface area, which also reduces the drag. Now, additionally, ergonomics is a big factor here because it doesn't matter how fast or efficient your hull shape is if you can't efficiently deliver that power to the water. So when I was designing the LPB, I wasn't looking to create a racing boat. The idea here was to give it a waterline that is targeted at a high but not extremely high speed, and then to combine that with a lower wetted surface area hull shape and fitness-oriented ergonomics. And the combination of all those things gives us a really nice, efficient, fast cruising pace with a fairly respectable top speed as well. Now, talking a little bit more about the shaping, I tend to design with a fairly flared hull section to keep the waterline nice and narrow, and then I add the secondary stability above the waterline. And this particular hull shaping actually feels a little bit weird when you first get into it because you have to lean farther to get the secondary stability to engage, but I find that most people get used to that pretty quickly, and I feel like it's a good trade-off to get that extra paddling efficiency. So just to give you a quick example here, this is me paddling the LPB at a completely relaxed pace. Now here I'm starting to push this up to more of a moderate fitness pace. And then finally here I am doing a flat out sprint. Now keep in mind that this is me paddling and I don't actually paddle that much these days due to some health issues. So someone who's actually a fitness paddler could probably do a little bit better than that. Now, obviously, this type of a shape starts to drag pretty hard when it gets up to sprint speed, so something like this is never going to be a really good sprint boat, but at a moderate fitness pace, I feel like this is easily competitive with most of the other fast sea kayaks that are out there, and definitely faster than anything else that could even begin to compare with the same level of maneuverability and playfulness. So next up here, let's talk about rolling a little bit. Although, to be perfectly honest, this is not something that I spend a lot of time thinking about because the reality is that if your roll is so weak that the kayak is what makes the difference between whether you're going to be successful or not in your roll, you're not going to be able to be successful in any kayak in real world conditions where the added stress immediately cuts at least 30% off the top of the power of your roll. And conversely, if your roll is good enough to be reliable in real world conditions, you're not going to have a problem rolling any sea kayak. So personally, I don't put much thought into rolling when I'm designing kayaks because most of what you would do to make a kayak roll better starts to really negatively affect the performance in other ways, and that's just not a trade-off that I'm willing to make. So unless you're specifically looking for a rolling kayak for practicing harder Greenland rolls, I feel like any kayak is going to be as good as any other. And as far as how the LPB compares to anything else that's out there, I think it's probably right in the middle. It's not the most amazing rolling kayak, but it does pretty good. So just to give you an example, personally, I roll less than once a year right now because of my health issues, but I can still do most of the standard Greenland rolls in an LPB and a few of the harder ones as well. I can't hand roll it like I can a Greenland kayak, but it will definitely do the job for anything I need to do in a real world rolling situation. So moving on to the touring performance now, as far as the overall volume goes, the LPB is really pretty comparable to the F1, which means that this is a good kayak for lightweight camping trips up to about a week long. Although I have had people do much longer trips than that, including my friend Claire, who did a 1,000-mile trip down the Columbia River in her F1, resupplying every couple weeks. So if you're used to packing like a backpacker, you should be able to stretch one of these up to about 2 weeks, although that does start to get pretty tight for my personal packing taste. Now, fortunately, just like the F1, the LPB was designed around being able to easily load and unload gear, so both of these kayaks are much easier to camp out of than most other skin-on-frame kayaks. Also, it should go without saying that the combination of a 35-pound lightweight touring load with a 35-pound kayak makes for a much more enjoyable touring experience than a 60-pound kayak with a 60-pound camping load. So, a couple final points here. If you're new here and you're wondering about the durability of this style of kayak, the best way to learn more about that is just to go to the video where I talk about skin-on-frame durability. I'll make sure I put up a card on the screen for that right now. But the short answer is that these are not indestructible, but they are much tougher than you would imagine. Now, if you're curious about other people's experiences with the LPB or any of our other kayaks, you can find some examples on our Student Builds blog. And notice when you go there that you can actually filter by kayak type so you can zero in really quickly on the type of boat that you're interested in. Also, if you check out our Facebook group, there's a couple people there that have posted their experiences with the LPB. And then one more that's not posted anywhere, but I wanted to share with you anyways, was the experience of one of my students, Robert, in British Columbia, who is an ex-Olympic cyclist and owns a whole bunch of other fast sea kayaks. So Robert built the 190-pound size right after I released it, and I'm always nervous whenever serious athletes are building these boats because you know that if things aren't perfect, you're definitely going to hear about it. And I just want to read you the email that he sent me. I've got this saved on my phone, so hang on here for a sec. Hey Brian, I've had the LPB out on the water for a couple weeks now. From flat calm to 15-knot winds and rough seas, it handles extremely well, it tracks well, it edges well. Primary and secondary stability are both good. I took it out for a little self-rescue practice, wet exits, self-recovery and rolls, performed well on all tasks. Perhaps you should change the name of the LPB from long pointy boat to long performance boat. So that is some pretty great feedback. It always feels good to get an email like that, especially from someone who's picky. Also, I want to mention that my friend Lisa in Missouri, who's actually built 6 of our kayaks at this point, last year she built herself a smaller size LPB and participated in the MR 340 race, which is a 340-mile race down the Missouri River. Lisa is a fairly strong paddler, although she's not an elite athlete by any means, and she actually placed pretty darn well, which has a lot to do with her, but it also has to do with the comfort and the efficiency of the boat. So, like I said in the beginning, this kayak comes in 5 different sizes right now, targeting paddler weights from 125 pounds up to 250 pounds, although I'm still tweaking the outside of that size range. So if you're interested in building one of these, make sure that you shoot me a message because we might want to make some changes on your boat that aren't in the plans. Also, because this is skin on frame, it's really easy to make personalized modifications. And I also offer this same kayak in a flat decked version, just like we do with the F1, which is not my personal preference for all the reasons that I mentioned in the flat deck F1 design video, but it is an option if you have that particular set of needs. Now, as far as whether you should build an LPB or an F1 or get a totally different kind of kayak altogether, it really just comes down to what you want to do on the water. I will say that I've had a lot of people build LPBs that later went on to build F1s, even some fairly serious athletes like my friend Jesse, who also owns a small fleet of other fast sea kayaks. But I've also had a few people build the F1 that later decided to build LPBs. I do want to finish, however, by reminding you that the LPB is a harder kayak to build. It's not a huge amount harder, but it does take a bit more work and a bit higher skill level. So if this is your first skin-on frame boat and you're not certain about your skills, the F1 might be a better starting point. All right, I think that's it for now. Thanks for watching. As always, if you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. You can also find us on our website, CapeFalconKayaks.com, where we've got skin-on frame building video courses, plan sets, and various free skin-on frame resources. You can also find us on Instagram at CapeFalconBuilds, where we post photos and short videos of everything we're working on here in the shop and out on the water. And just like I say every time, even if you're not normally a social media person, I would really encourage you to check out the Instagram feed because there is so much more cool stuff there than ever shows up here on the YouTube channel. Once again, that is at CapeFalconBuilds on Instagram. Take care, be safe on the water, and have fun building your skin boat.